Thanks everyone for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad to welcome to the show Theia Chatelle, who's an experienced conflict correspondent based in Ramallah and is currently pursuing an MA in American Studies at Yale University. Theia, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. And I want to dive right in. Late last year, December 20th, you wrote a piece for Jewish Currents titled Inside the Yale Police Department's War on Student Protestors. And I just want to give a brief quote from the piece to help set the stage. Quote, emails with the FBI were just some of the 1,936 files that Yale handed over in a settlement agreement to close out a Freedom of Information Act FOIA lawsuit I filed in late May 2024, which together document the university's repressive strategy in dealing with pro-Palestine students, end quote. So, Theia, I want to just start here. What prompted you to file this FOIA lawsuit to begin with?
Yeah, so that lawsuit really was the product of other journalism that I'd done on campus, investigating the Yale Police Department's ties to surveillance on campus, but before the pro-Palestine encampments. So I was familiar with the process, and I knew that the Yale Police Department was subject to FOIA law per a ruling from the Yale Freedom of Information Commission, I think about 10 or 11 years ago. And I had filed a Freedom of Information Act request shortly after the pro-Palestine encampments were cleared and student protesters were disciplined. And Yale had drawn out the process again and again and again. I'd have to go back and check, but I think I sent at least 40 emails to Yale's chief information officer asking for when they would provide the documents, if they had an estimated date for when they would be ready. And they kept promising them by certain dates and giving themselves deadlines and then not meeting them. So it eventually got to the point where I said, okay, if you don't give them to me by this date, then I'm going to file a lawsuit to compel you to comply with the law that you had so far refused to do. And that's really what brought it about. I didn't have any experience filing lawsuits, and I really didn't want to because it's quite honestly a pain. But it was sort of the end result of Yale's failure to comply with the law.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad that you did it. I agree. Filing lawsuits is one of my least favorite things to do. And I want to talk a little bit because you mentioned, and I want to get into some more detailed issues with the surveillance that you talk about. But
Sure.
I mean, it's just so like what these documents reveal is just. I mean, it's one of those things where you're like, I kind of felt like this was happening, but to have it in writing just feels that much more heavy. You write that, quote, the documents reveal that Yale PD installed cameras on campus, tracked students' social media accounts, monitored students using aerial drones. They also collaborated with New Haven Police Department, other university police, pro-Israel organizations, and even federal counter-terrorism intelligence sharing. So I want to start with this. I'm curious, like, were you expecting this? Was it like, oh, I just want to have proof of this, or were you kind of blown away with the depth and breadth of what Yale PD's power and interest in this particular topic?
Yeah, I think just like you, it was something I was sort of expecting. We had all witnessed the intense repression on campus at UCLA, at Columbia, calling in outside law enforcement to harass and arrest student protesters. But what I didn't expect is the level of coordination and communication between a university police department, federal intelligence, and just these layers and networks of outside intelligence units, and really the effort to which the Yale Police Department put into their surveillance, like their surveillance of students who supposedly they're supposed to be protecting from what they would say people outside of campus or like other threats. But instead, what they're doing is surveilling their own students with these like advanced tactics is one word for it. A lot of it was just like brute force stalking of student social media accounts. And I think honestly, as I saw on Twitter, like one of the most surprising revelations was that Yale had like purchased these military grade drones to, they wouldn't release the specific documents that said like when or where or why they purchased them, but we did have the flight logs documenting that they were flying over the student encampments. And then of course we had the images, one of which was an infrared image taken of students sleeping in their tents on cross campus, which I think was startling, not just for me, but for a lot of people who saw it, because it so closely mirrored aerial drone photography before the United States would conduct airstrikes in Iraq or Afghanistan. And instead, in this case, these are student protesters on their own campus. So I can't say it was expected, but it was definitely startling.
Yeah, absolutely. And I saw one of the pictures, one of the aerial photographs is at the top of the article that you published, and
Mhm.
it is it's very creepy just to see that level of surveillance for people who are really just sitting there. Like
Yeah,
there's no illegal activity happening. And even if there were, you could make the argument that this is an unacceptable amount of surveillance. But for people hanging out in a quad, this is, I mean, Orwell wouldn't even have anything to go on here. And
wow.
I want to talk a little bit about Yale Police Department because, particularly for listeners that are not familiar with US universities or even outside of the US, just the thought that a university has its own police department, I think, is really bizarre and terrifying. Not, but also you mentioned that there's an increasing amount of power that these university police departments have, not just
Mhm.
on campus, but off campus,
Yeah,
as
exactly.
well as an increased access to militarization. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Yale's police department is actually the oldest university police department in the country. And its history really tells you a lot of what you need to know about how it's acting today, right? It was founded um, as many analysts have written, sort of as Yale was developing its relationship with New Haven, and relationship is, to put it quite kindly, of policing, of scare tactics, of fear, of separation between the ultra wealthy students attending Yale's campus and the predominantly like person of color population of New Haven that is still to this day highly impoverished. Homelessness is still a really big issue, and Yale is hoarding these resources with its in excess of $40 billion endowment. And I think a lot can be said that this police department is there to protect its reputation, is there to protect its resources, its assets. And Yale has so much money that it can essentially do whatever it wants. And having a private police department, which, as you mentioned, has law enforcement powers. So not only are they compelled to protect its own campus, but they can also arrest New Haven residents. And they collaborate very closely with the New Haven Police Department. And this is exactly why Yale is actually subject to the Freedom of Information Act, because the Yale Police Department has public agency powers to arrest New Haven residents. Therefore, the commission determined that they were a public agency and then subject to the same disclosures that any other public agency like the New Haven Police Department would be subject to. So it sort of, it bit them in the end that they had to hand over these documents because of that. But also there's a very, very long history of racial violence and repression at the hands of the Yale Police Department, including shooting unarmed New Haven residents, which happened, I believe, 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable. And I'm just trying to think of the situations where Yale PD would even be wandering around New Haven. I mean, what is the could you talk a little bit about like the scope of what Yale PD usually does? I mean, even before these encampments started, what would Yale PD be doing in New Haven off the campus of Yale University?
Yeah. The Yale Police Department plays a very central role in policing the New Haven community. There are actually three police departments that operate in downtown and central New Haven. There's the Hampden Police Department, the Yale Police Department, and the New Haven Police Department. Um, and I think there is also a lot to be said. I'll reference a work of my colleague, Anthony Lowenstein, who wrote The Palestine Laboratory, which sort of talks about how Israeli surveillance technology is tested in the occupied Palestinian territories and then exported elsewhere across the world. And I think you can draw a parallel in this situation that the Yale Police Department was testing its surveillance, its like arrest powers on New Haven residents, and then eventually it worked its way back to its own students. So they were testing it on New Haven residents, like widespread documentation of harassment, arbitrary arrest, detention. Actually, the reason that the Information Act lawsuit was filed, I believe it was back in 2011, was because a lawyer was seeking documents related to the arrest of a New Haven resident by the Yale Police Department. It wasn't even about a Yale student, which they were then compelled to provide the documents, which is how I got mine. But there's a really long history here, and I think those surveillance tactics that YPD ended up using, the installation of cameras, the like arrest plans that I was given as a part of the settlement, which details like how they're going to target protesters, who's going to be doing the arrest. All of those things were developed in New Haven and then brought onto the campus community.
Yeah, it's a very interesting parallel and a terrifying one. And I want to talk a little bit about that web of surveillance that you discuss in the article, because you write that it's not just things like drones and campus cameras, which would be awful enough, but
Mhm,
tracking students' movements, for instance, via the use of their ID cards.
mhm,
And as I understand it, students then have like ID cards to get into buildings and things like that, using
mhm.
them at the cafeteria and things like that. It seems like students these days are kind of subject to a panopticon type surveillance as soon as they set
Yes.
foot on campus. And I'm wondering if you could not only talk a little bit about that, but also talk about like, is there, because Yale is technically private property, is there some kind of ability for them to say, oh, your constitutional rights don't apply here, and we get to put you in a panopticon because you've agreed to be on campus?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. And I think Yale's logic here, and what's at stake for it is its power, right? Yale last spring was confronting a mass grassroots student-led movement against its endowment, against its investment practices, and really was calling its power into question. And they were sort of confronted, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to deal with a student-led movement coming from our own campus, not from outside, from our own students that we selected to attend here? And what are we going to do? And as you said, not only did they engage in widespread surveillance and repression, but really they used brute force tactics. They charged the student protesters who were arrested for sleeping on university property, on university grounds that they attend, and were charged with really advanced misdemeanors. And they were brought to court, and they were eventually, the vast majority of them have settled. But still, the university was trying to scare the protesters. And one case that I think really stands out and was notable is that one student during the first encampment let down the American flag on Central Yale campus. And really, there's this widespread mass efforts that I saw in email exchanges between police officers, that I saw in a dossier assembled on the student, that they were tracking the student swipes. They were taking surveillance photos of the student walking through university buildings, tracking them as they walked off campus and towards a different location after they let the flag pull down. And eventually, they were identified and then later arrested because a Yale security officer, not even someone that was affiliated with the Yale Police Department, recognized the student from their on-campus job, passed it off to Yale Police Department, and then they were arrested, held in jail overnight, and then charged with quite an advanced, like they were charged with something quite advanced. And Yale said that like the bill of cost to repair the American flag was thousands and thousands of dollars, which is quite ridiculous. And it was absurd reading the email. But this just shows like how scared Yale was by these student protesters. And more importantly, all the media attention it was getting, and it was really damaging its reputation.
Yeah, I mean, because Yale is supposed to create the leaders of tomorrow, right? And the leaders
That's
of
what they
tomorrow
say.
obviously have to uphold the policy of the United States empire, which of course is right now perpetuating a genocide. So if that chafes against what the students are doing, then that's very awkward for them. And I mean, at the core of this is also, following the money in any of these situations. And you talk also in the article about not just the collaboration that happens between law enforcement agencies, but also pro-Zionist organizations and
Mhm.
these so-called anti-terrorism fusion centers. Could you talk a little bit about those kind of collaborations?
Yeah, I will say it took, after reading through all the documents a couple of times, it took a really long time to sort of like parse out the relationships between the Yale Police Department and these different layers of enforcement powers, whether that's on the state level, the federal level, the local level, and also these interested parties, non-governmental organizations that were sort of pressuring the university to take action against protesters. So I think the case of the fusion centers is like one notable example of this. So for those who don't know, fusion centers were established in the wake of 9/11 as sort of partnerships between federal law enforcement, state law enforcement, local law enforcement, as a means to share intelligence and conduct what they call like counter-terrorism efforts. And what the ACLU eventually had to file a lawsuit against these, and there were many, many lawsuits about unlawful surveillance, unlawful repression of primarily Muslim Americans and people of color after 9/11. That was not justified. It was unconstitutional. It was illegal. But these fusion centers that were doing intelligence sharing were engaging in this widespread repression. And of course, this has been documented for at least the past decade, but Yale Police Department still chose to engage with these intelligence sharing and had direct contact with the FBI on multiple different occasions, including filing hate crime charges against certain students protesting in support of Palestine. So again, this is just like another example of the repression and the linkages between these different institutions, all bearing down on these student protesters, many of whom are teenagers, right? So that's the fusion centers. And of course, there are also outside organizations. So Zionist organizations in New Haven across the country, Hillel International was really involved in pressuring Yale to take action against student protesters, reaching out to the YPD against certain instances that they had been reached out to about. And really, there are just so many different interests all like coming in and pressuring the university to crack down on these protests, which is exactly what they ended up doing.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about the status right now of these crackdowns. I mean, I'm assuming because it's January, there's no encampment going right now, but what does organizing on campus look like right now in the wake of this information that you were able to attain through this very annoying lawsuit? And has there been any response from the university, and what is the status of like these court cases or these cases against students?
Yeah, so I reached out to the university on multiple different occasions asking for them to comment on the allegations and the evidence contained in the documents, and they refused to do so. Um, and one of the emails that I received that was particularly striking and upsetting, the chief or like a high-level advisor in the Yale Police Department actually called the student protesters pathetic and sad. And remember that these are the students that the Yale Police Department is supposed to be protecting, right? So Yale refused to comment on any of the allegations, on anything that was contained in the documents that they handed over. And really, I'm sorry and sad to say that the repression has worked, right? Speaking with students on campus, students are scared. Students of scared are being sent to the executive committee of being disciplined, suspended, or worse. We're seeing at NYU, we're seeing at Columbia, Barnard, UCLA, that students are being suspended, they're being expelled, like in Vanderbilt. And really, universities are throwing the full weight of their institutional proceedings against students. And again, these are quasi-legal, so students don't have any of the rights that they would have in a formal legal proceeding. And really, they're trying to shut down dissent. And while many of the students who were arrested on Yale's campus for peacefully protesting settled with the university and committed to doing like community service volunteering, there are quite a few students who have refused to do that because they object to the charges that were filed. They say, we're students at this university. You can't arrest us for trespassing on our own campus for peacefully protesting. It's quite absurd. And I think there's also a lot to be said about the power of the student movement in turning public opinion, of galvanizing these protests against the occupation of Palestine.
Yeah, absolutely, which is why, of course, they have to crack down on them because it was quite a popcorn event last summer into fall I mean, I'm in Baltimore and there were encampments here. I mean, I don't know of a larger city with big universities that didn't have encampments. And I'm curious if you're not just on that side, but on the other side, do you feel that the behavior of Yale Police Department is indicative of how authorities at other colleges and universities are cracking down on any kind of student behavior, and how that this could be used not just for pro-Palestinian, but let's say environmental action or even action against, like a university if students feel that something's unjust at the university, things like that. Do you feel that this is indicative of a larger wave of anti-free speech, anti-protest activity by these kind of authorities?
Yeah, I think it definitely is. And something that I saw in the documents was multiple examples of communication between the Yale Police Department and other university police departments all across the country. So not only did the repression at different universities mirror one another, but the police departments were also directly coordinating their actions and testing out tactics, asking different chiefs of police what worked on their campus, in air quotes, and really trying to, because that they were taken by surprise by these encampments. They had no idea how to respond. And as they're messaging, like I was reading their emails, as they're messaging back and forth, they're testing out tactics. And really the tactics they're testing out are different forms of repression. They're trying to see what works best to get students to vacate their encampments and to stop speaking out in support of Palestine. And I think this repression doesn't stay just against pro-Palestine students, right? They're testing out these strategies just like they did in New Haven and Yale's case, and they're going to be used elsewhere. And I think this just mirrors like the next level of repression we're experiencing at universities. I believe it was just yesterday or 2 days ago, Catherine Franke at Columbia was essentially pushed out. She's a tenured professor, spoke out in support of pro-Palestine protesters, and she's forced out, no longer employed at Columbia. And I think like it's a really worrying trend for academics, for students, for free expression, that these tactics have been tested. The university views them as successful, and they're going to keep using them.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you that. Do you think that there will be any, because you've brought this to light, do you feel that there will be any movements, like any lawsuits about the legality of this kind of level of surveillance? Are you seeing any movement in that direction?
Yeah, I think people are definitely talking about it. And my understanding is that legal organizations that are working in support of pro-Palestine students are so overwhelmed with their caseloads right now because just the repression is unmatched. It's unprecedented. There are so many students who have been arrested, who have been suspended. And for example, like Palestine Legal is just trying to like keep up. So I think years from now, or however long, when people are going to be looking back at this trend of repression and the incidents that took place on not just on Yale's campus, but across the country, I think a lot of discussions are going to be had about the legality of their surveillance, of their tactics. And yeah, I do see the potential for lawsuits challenging the legality of these practices. And I think, honestly, looking at the documents, I think it's quite deserved.
Absolutely. And thank you for the struggle of getting access to them. And I want to finally, I want to ask you a question that's based not just on your experience with this, but your experience as an investigative reporter in Ramallah. What would you say to people who are organizing to not basically lose, I don't want to say hope because it sounds so trite, but not lose sight of what we're struggling for, but also to remain safe, like best practices in that kind of sense, to keep going on this and not to give up just because of this repression?
Yeah, I think about something that a really close friend of mine who lives in Nazareth told me, which is that in the wake of all of this repression, so like when I'm living in the West Bank and I see the checkpoints and I've had guns pointed at me, I've been shot at, I've been arrested, I've been detained, um, and really being in a place like Palestine, where the level of repression is so intense and it's so severe. And I also witnessed this reporting on Yale's campus and seeing what happened at other universities, is you can't normalize it. You can't make it seem okay, because the second it becomes normalized, it's impossible to fight back against. So you have to constantly call it out and say that when there's a drone, a surveillance drone flying above a protest, that's not normal. We can't let that be okay. That's not justified, and it shouldn't be allowed. Because as soon as it becomes normalized, they win, right? And I think that's what you have to constantly remind yourself of, but also recognize people have been struggling against the occupation for decades, right? And the momentum is still going. People are holding steadfast. And I think we just have to look at the people who have been fighting this fight for decades and see that like it is possible. It is possible to maintain that momentum. It is possible to take care of yourself and the people that you love who are also involved in the movement. And you can't lose hope. You can't lose faith. I haven't, and I don't plan on doing so. Yeah, and I really think that's the takeaway here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time sitting down with us and talking about this. Again, if folks would like to check it out, it's a great piece up at Jewish Currents titled Inside the Yale Police Department's War on Student Protesters. Thea, where's a good place for people to follow your work?
Yeah, you can follow me on Instagram, or Twitter. It's just my name. Or you can check out some of my other writing on my website, which is also just my name. So Theia Chatelle.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.